There are moments so powerful that everyone who witnesses them remembers exactly where they were. This was one of those nights. Before the sun rose over Las Vegas, one man would challenge a legend and leave believing in him even more than those who had worshipped him for years. But when the challenge was first spoken aloud, no one in that ballroom could have imagined how the night would end. Las Vegas was alive. The city glittered beneath the desert sky like a sea of diamonds, its endless lights stretching toward the horizon as though the night itself refused to surrender to morning. Luxury cars rolled silently beneath the glowing entrance of one of the most exclusive hotels in America. Only a handful of people had received an invitation. No reporters, no newspapers, no television cameras, no public audience, only the biggest names in entertainment. If someone had walked into that ballroom and looked around, they would have believed they had stepped inside Hollywood itself. Academy Award winners, chart-topping singers, television icons, legendary comedians, powerful producers, world-famous musicians. Every table held people whose names filled magazine covers. Every handshake carried influence. Every smile hid a story. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom with warm golden light. An elegant orchestra filled the room with soft jazz, while waiters glided effortlessly between guests, carrying silver trays topped with crystal glasses. The atmosphere felt perfect. Too perfect. Because beneath the laughter, beneath the expensive suits, beneath the sparkling gowns, something invisible was quietly growing. Expectation. No matter which conversation you listened to, sooner or later the same name appeared. Elvis Presley. Some admired him without question. Some respected him. Some envied him. Others secretly wondered whether anyone truly deserved to be called the king. One famous producer leaned toward another. "Do you think he'll come?" "He always does." "I heard he's changed." Fame changes everyone. Nearby, a songwriter smiled. "Not Elvis." An older musician slowly shook his head. "You'll see." The room carried different opinions, but one fact united everyone. The moment Elvis entered, everything else would become secondary. Across the ballroom stood Dean Martin. Relaxed, elegant, confident. His effortless charm had made him one of the most beloved entertainers in America. People naturally gathered around him because they never knew what joke would come next. Tonight was no different. Laughter surrounded his table. Stories flowed effortlessly. Champagne glasses continued to rise. But every few moments, Dean's eyes drifted toward the entrance, watching, waiting, measuring, almost as though this evening had become something more than another glamorous gathering. One comedian standing beside him laughed. "You're unusually quiet tonight." Dean smiled. "I'm thinking." Dangerous habit. More laughter. Dean chuckled politely, but his attention never left the doors. "Tell me something." He looked around the table. Why does everyone call Elvis the king? The question surprised everyone. One producer answered immediately. Because nobody can touch him. Another disagreed. Because people decided he was bigger than music. A famous songwriter leaned forward. "No." He smiled. Because when he walks into a room, nobody asks for attention anymore. Dean slowly swirled the drink inside his glass. Interesting answer. He looked back toward the entrance. Let's find out if that's really true. No one noticed how serious his voice had become. Then, the enormous ballroom door slowly opened. The orchestra continued playing. Conversations carried on. Nobody reacted at first, until someone whispered, "He's here." Another voice followed. "Elvis just arrived." Like falling dominoes, every conversation stopped. Heads turned one after another. Even the orchestra seemed quieter, although nobody had asked them to lower their instruments. Then he appeared. Elvis Presley stepped into the ballroom without bodyguards surrounding him, without dramatic music, without photographers announcing his arrival, without trying to become the center of attention. Yet somehow, he became exactly that. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit with a crisp white shirt and a neatly folded pocket square. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant. Everything about him reflected quiet confidence rather than celebrity. His famous smile appeared before he spoke a single word. Instead of greeting the wealthiest guests first, he walked toward the orchestra. He shook hands with the pianist, thanked the trumpet player for performing, complimented the conductor. The musicians looked genuinely surprised. Most celebrities barely acknowledged them. Elvis greeted them as equals. Then he noticed an elderly waiter struggling to carry an overloaded silver tray. Without hesitation, Elvis stepped forward, steadied the tray with one hand, smiled warmly. "Looks a little heavier than it should be." The waiter laughed nervously. "Thank you, Mr. Presley." "Please." Elvis smiled. "Tonight, we're just two men trying not to spill the drinks." Several nearby guests quietly witnessed the exchange. One actress whispered, "Did you see that?" Another nodded. He always notices the people nobody else notices. Across the ballroom, Dean Martin noticed too. He watched every handshake, every smile, every small act of kindness. The strange part wasn't what Elvis was doing. It was what everyone else was doing. Without realizing it, they were watching him. No announcement had been made. No speech had begun. Yet somehow, the entire ballroom slowly revolved around one man who hadn't asked for anyone's attention. Dean took another slow sip. His smile remained, but something behind that smile had changed. Curiosity, pride, competition. "Interesting," he murmured. The comedian beside him looked over. "What is?" Dean never looked away from Elvis. "He hasn't sung a note." A pause. "Hasn't told a joke." Another pause. "Hasn't even entered the room dramatically." He smiled, and somehow, his eyes narrowed slightly. Everyone already belongs to him. Nobody answered, because nobody could deny it. The room belonged to Elvis before he had spoken a single sentence. Dean gently placed his crystal glass on the polished wooden table. The soft sound echoed far louder than it should have. One producer sensed something immediately. "Dean." He lowered his voice. "Don't." Dean smiled. "Relax. I'm only going to ask him one question." The producer frowned. "Knowing you, one question is never just one question." Dean laughed quietly, but he had already made up his mind. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie, then walked toward the orchestra. The musicians looked confused as he reached for a microphone resting beside the piano. The conductor slowly lowered his baton. The music faded. One instrument after another fell silent. People stopped talking. Champagne glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Every instinct in the ballroom whispered the same thing. Something was about to happen. Dean turned slowly. His eyes met Elvis's from opposite ends of the ballroom. Neither man looked away. The distance between them suddenly felt enormous, not because of the space, but because of what everyone sensed was about to unfold. Dean lifted the microphone. His familiar smile returned, the same smile audiences had loved for years. Only tonight, it carried something sharper. Ladies and gentlemen, no one moved. We've spent years hearing the same title. He looked directly at Elvis. The King. Another pause, long enough for every heartbeat in the room to become noticeable. But titles are interesting things. His voice remained calm. Sometimes they're earned. A beat. Sometimes they're simply repeated so often that people stop questioning them. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody laughed. Dean took one slow step forward. So tell me, Elvis. The room became impossibly still. Tonight. Another pause. Are you finally going to prove you deserve that crown? Silence. Absolute silence. No music. No laughter. No whispers. Dozens of Hollywood legends stared at Elvis Presley. Some expected anger. Some expected a cutting joke. Some believed he would turn around and leave. Others thought he would answer immediately. Instead, Elvis simply looked at Dean Martin. His expression never changed. Then, the corner of his mouth slowly lifted into the smallest smile. He didn't defend himself. He didn't deny the challenge. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't say a single word. And somehow, that silence made the entire ballroom more uncomfortable than any argument ever could. Dean mistook the silence for hesitation. Several guests mistook it for fear. But hidden behind Elvis's calm smile was a decision that would change every person in that ballroom before the night was over. And Dean Martin had no idea he had just walked into a lesson he would never forget. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. Dean Martin still held the microphone. Elvis Presley still stood quietly across the ballroom. And somewhere in the distance, a single champagne glass gently touched the floor. The tiny sound echoed through the room like thunder. No one even turned to look. Every eye remained fixed on the two legends, standing only a few yards apart. The atmosphere had completely changed. Only moments earlier, the ballroom had been filled with music, laughter, and effortless conversation. Now, it felt like an arena before the opening bell. Dean smiled. At first, he believed he had already won. Elvis hadn't answered. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't argued. Maybe, Dean said into the microphone, his voice calm but unmistakably sharp. The king isn't used to being questioned. A few uneasy laughs drifted across the room. Not because the joke was especially funny, but because silence made people uncomfortable. Dean slowly began walking, one measured step after another. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor. Every step brought him closer to Elvis. You know, he stopped only a few feet away. I've always wondered something. Another pause. People spend years telling us who the greatest is. He looked around the ballroom. The greatest singer. The greatest actor. The greatest performer. Then he turned back toward Elvis. But the truly great ones. He leaned slightly closer. Never need other people to defend their reputation. The room grew even quieter. Several guests shifted nervously in their seats. A famous actress slowly crossed her arms. A songwriter lowered his eyes. Even the orchestra members exchanged uncertain glances. One producer whispered to another, "This is getting dangerous." The other nodded. "Someone needs to stop this." But nobody did, because everyone wanted to know what Elvis would do. Dean continued, "Come on, Elvis. Say something." "Nothing." "Tell everyone why you're the king." "Still nothing." Dean laughed softly. "Or perhaps." He shrugged. "You finally realized crowns are easier to wear than they are to earn." A louder wave of laughter spread through one side of the ballroom. Across the room, a young musician quietly shook his head. "He shouldn't have said that." An elderly pianist whispered, "Watch carefully." "Why?" The old man smiled faintly. "Because men like Elvis don't answer when everyone expects them to." Dean wasn't finished. He lifted the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen." He slowly turned toward the audience. "Perhaps we've been mistaken all these years." The room held its breath. Perhaps legends are only legends. He glanced back toward Elvis. "Until someone finally tests them." Silence. Every second became heavier. Every heartbeat seemed louder. Every face revealed the same question. Why isn't Elvis speaking? Some believed he was furious. Others believed he was embarrassed. A few quietly wondered if Dean had finally exposed a weakness no one had ever seen before. But Elvis's face revealed nothing. He simply stood there, calm, relaxed, almost peaceful. His breathing never changed. His posture never shifted. He wasn't staring at Dean with anger. He wasn't looking away in fear. Instead, he studied him with quiet understanding, as though he could see something nobody else could. Dean mistook that calmness for surrender. He smiled wider. "I gave you every opportunity. You could have embarrassed me. You could have insulted me. You could have reminded everyone why they call you the king." He spread his arms dramatically. Instead, another pause. "You chose silence." Then came the sentence that made the entire ballroom tense. "Maybe silence is all you have left." A collective gasp swept through the room. Several guests looked down. Others stared at Elvis with concern. One elderly woman quietly whispered, "Please don't answer with anger." Another guest murmured, "This can only end badly." Dean slowly lowered the microphone. A confident smile remained on his face. He believed the evening belonged to him. He believed he had cornered the most famous performer in America. He believed one more push would force Elvis to react. He was wrong. Because at that exact moment, Elvis finally moved. Not suddenly, not dramatically. He calmly adjusted the cuff of his jacket. He straightened his tie. Then he looked toward the orchestra. The conductor instinctively met his eyes. Neither man spoke. Yet somehow, the conductor understood. He slowly lifted his baton. One violinist tightened his grip. The pianist placed trembling fingers above the keys. The trumpet player inhaled deeply. Nobody in the audience understood what was happening. Dean frowned. "What's this?" Elvis still hadn't answered. Instead, he took his first step toward the stage. Click. The sound of his shoe echoed through the silent ballroom. Another step. Click. No one breathed. Another. Click. The distance between Elvis and the microphone grew shorter. With every step, Dean's confidence grew smaller. Something had changed. Nobody could explain it. Elvis hadn't spoken a single word. Yet somehow, he had taken complete control of the room. By the time he reached the stage, The ballroom had become so silent that the faint hum of the chandeliers could almost be heard. Elvis stopped in front of the microphone. He looked at Dean. Then he looked across the audience. Movie stars, musicians, comedians, friends, critics. Every pair of eyes waited for the same thing. A sharp comeback, a clever joke, a public humiliation. Instead, Elvis smiled, the same calm smile he had worn from the very beginning. He leaned toward the microphone, opened his mouth, and the first words he spoke would leave every person in that ballroom questioning everything they thought they knew about greatness. The ballroom held its breath. No one blinked. No one whispered. Dozens of Hollywood legends stood frozen, waiting for the words they were certain would ignite the biggest confrontation of the year. Elvis rested one hand on the microphone. His eyes slowly moved across the room. He looked at the orchestra, at the waiters, at the actors, at the producers, at the singers. Finally, his eyes settled on Dean Martin. Dean stood confidently with his arms folded. He still believed Elvis was about to defend his title. He expected a clever joke, a sharp insult, a line that would make the audience erupt with laughter. Instead, Elvis smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man trying to win. It was the smile of a man who had already made peace with himself long before he walked into that ballroom. When he finally spoke, his voice was so calm that people instinctively leaned closer just to hear him. "Dean," he paused, "you've given everyone here a question tonight." Another pause. "Now allow me to answer it." The room became perfectly still. People have called me many things. Some call me lucky. Some call me famous. Some call me the king. He gently shook his head. But none of those titles belong to me. A few confused glances spread across the audience. Elvis continued, "Because titles are not something a man can give himself. They are something other people choose to give, if they believe you've earned them." Dean's smile slowly began to fade. Elvis looked directly into his eyes. "Tonight you asked me to prove I deserve a crown." A gentle smile returned. "But if I have to tell people I'm a king..." He paused. "Then I probably never was one." Silence. No applause. No movement. Every person in the ballroom felt the weight of those words. Elvis slowly turned toward the orchestra. "My friends, would you help me answer the rest?" The conductor quietly nodded. He raised his baton. The first piano note floated through the ballroom like a whisper. Soft, gentle, almost fragile. Then the strings joined. The trumpet followed. Finally, Elvis began to sing. There was no anger in his voice. No desire for revenge. No attempt to embarrass Dean Martin. He sang as though no challenge had ever been spoken. Every lyric carried warmth. Every note carried honesty. Every breath carried gratitude. As the song filled the ballroom, something extraordinary happened. The tension that had consumed the room slowly disappeared. People who had been waiting for a fight suddenly forgot there had ever been one. One actress quietly wiped tears from her eyes. An elderly songwriter removed his glasses and lowered his head. A young musician whispered, "Now I understand." Beside him, another simply nodded. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Not even with applause. Dean Martin remained exactly where he stood. His confident smile had disappeared. His shoulders slowly relaxed. The microphone that had once felt so powerful now hung loosely at his side. He wasn't looking at a rival anymore. He was watching an artist who had chosen dignity over victory. As the final chorus approached, the orchestra grew softer. Elvis's voice remained steady. Every word seemed to fill every corner of the ballroom. Then, the final note arrived. It lingered in the air for only a heartbeat, and disappeared. Silence. Complete silence. Not because people didn't know what to do. Because they couldn't. For several long moments, no one clapped. No one spoke. Some guests forgot they were even standing. Others stared at Elvis with tears quietly running down their faces. Even the orchestra remained perfectly still. It felt as though the entire ballroom was afraid that making a sound would destroy the moment they had just experienced. Dean looked around the room. For the first time that evening, he saw what everyone else saw. This had never been about winning an argument. It had never been about defending a title. It had been about revealing character. Slowly, Dean took a deep breath. Then he began walking toward the stage. Every step echoed through the silent ballroom. This time, no one watched Elvis. Every eye followed Dean. When he reached the stage, he stopped only a few inches away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Dean looked down, then slowly lifted the microphone. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard before. I walked into this room believing I could test a legend. He smiled faintly. Instead, he looked at Elvis. The legend tested me. A few guests lowered their heads. Dean continued. I thought greatness was measured by confidence. Tonight, he glanced around the ballroom. I learned it's measured by humility. Another pause. I thought the loudest man in the room would win. He shook his head. Instead, the quietest man reminded all of us what real strength looks like. Dean slowly extended his hand. The ballroom waited. Elvis smiled with the same warmth he had shown from the beginning of the evening. Without the slightest hesitation, he reached forward and shook Dean's hand. Not as a winner, not as a defeated opponent, but as a friend. Then Elvis gently placed his free hand on Dean's shoulder. We're entertainers, Dean, he said with a quiet smile. The world already has enough battles. Let's give them something better to remember. Dean laughed softly. The tension that had filled the ballroom all night finally disappeared. Someone in the audience began applauding. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The applause grew louder and louder. It echoed from every wall beneath the crystal chandeliers like rolling thunder. Some applauded Elvis. Some applauded Dean. Most applauded the lesson they had just witnessed. For nearly several minutes, the standing ovation refused to end. Elvis never bowed. He never raised his hands in celebration. He simply thanked the orchestra, shook hands with the musicians one by one, thanked the waiters who had served the evening, smiled at the photographers, and quietly stepped away from the spotlight. Dean watched him disappear into the crowd. Then he smiled to himself, almost in disbelief. Now I understand, he whispered. That's why they call him the king. Years later, people who attended that private gathering struggled to remember every song that had been performed. Some couldn't remember what was served for dinner. Others forgot who had been sitting at their table. But every single one of them remembered one moment. The moment a room full of powerful voices was silenced by one man who refused to let his ego speak louder than his character. Because real greatness is never announced. It is recognized. And sometimes, the most unforgettable comeback is not the one that humiliates another person. It is the one that inspires them to become better. That was the night Elvis Presley didn't defend his crown. He reminded everyone why they had placed it on his head in the first place.